Welcome to CSIS. I'm John Alterman, Senior Vice President, Zbigniew Brzezinski Chair on Global Security and Geostrategy, and the Director of the Middle East Program. It is my pleasure to welcome not only you today, but also our special guest, Jake Sullivan. Jake is a non-resident senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Last year, he was a visiting scholar at both Yale and Dartmouth. He had a series of senior roles in the Obama administration, including National Security Advisor to Vice President Biden, as the Director of the Policy Planning Staff, and Deputy Chief of Staff to Secretary of State Hillary Clinton. He has been very prolific in recent months, writing many things, including what I thought was a really interesting article on the Foreign Affairs webpage that he wrote with Daniel Ben-Haim called America's Opportunity in the Middle East. He argues that the region's current economic and defense insecurity creates an opportunity for what he calls aggressive US diplomacy. The centerpiece that he argues for is a structured regional dialogue that the US facilitates in cooperation with its partners. Jake, I hope you're keeping safe and healthy, and thanks very much for joining us.
I really appreciate getting the opportunity to come, and it's good to see you virtually through the computer portal, John.
Thank you very much. My colleague Tony Cordesman today put out a commentary which said, no one in the Gulf can now predict the level of US commitment to staying in the region or of the risk that US pressure on Iran will provoke a war. Dependence on the United States is now coupled to a region-wide lack of trust. Your article talks about balancing anxiety with reassurance. How do you build from the baseline that Tony described to balancing anxiety and reassurance to getting to where we need to go?
Well, I would start by observing something that's sort of a cousin to the observation that Tony Cordesman was making, which is a point that we make in our article. And that is that I think key leaders in the Gulf in particular are recognizing that there is no deus ex machina, that the kind of neocon deus ex machina of the Bush-Cheney years wasn't going to deliver them, nor is the Trump, Bolton, Pompeo maximum pressure campaign against Iran going to deliver them. And so they recognize that they are going to have to take matters into their own hands to a more significant degree. That presents an opportunity. Now, on the other hand, if all we do then is say, you guys are left to your own devices, good luck, we're out of here, that could produce all kinds of deleterious outcomes, including hedging behavior and choices born more of insecurity than of a sense of confidence. So my view is that the direct answer to your question about how you deal with the Cordesman problem is by being more realistic, by being more constrained in terms of what we can pledge from the perspective of delivering on security outcomes that the Gulf states want, such as, toppling the Iranian regime or getting the Iranian regime to crumble, which has been the message that the current administration has been sending. And rather to say, let's all collectively be realistic about what we can accomplish and find a path forward that will involve a continuing US commitment in the region on the one hand, but will also involve a rebalance or recalibration away from a primarily military approach to one that accentuates and emphasizes diplomacy to a much greater degree.
And so that requires the Iranians playing ball. And I mean, I guess the question is, how do you get the Iranians to a place where they want to play ball? When you were in the Obama administration, there was a long period of time when there were talks between the US and the Iranians that didn't get anywhere because President Ahmadinejad was the president. You had that secret meeting in Oman with Bill Burns in March 2013 that led to the JCPOA negotiations, but what it hinged on was the Rouhani election. There's an Iranian election coming up in May or June of next year. How important is the outcome of that election for how the US approaches security relationships with the Iranians and with the Gulf more broadly?
Look, it's not irrelevant. The election of Rouhani was not irrelevant toward the outcome of nuclear diplomacy, but it's also not dispositive because at the end of the day, the Iranian calculus is going to be driven more out of a combination of where the Supreme Leader and the IRGC and the Supreme Council on National Security are than where the president's office is. So what I think that election will tell us is something about the grip of the hardliners on the regime. And yes, I am still one who believes that while the kind of caricature of the reformists on the one hand and the hardliners on the other hand isn't quite right, that there is a diversity of opinion within the Iranian leadership and that we have to pay attention to that. So I think it will tell us something. And I think if you end up with somebody in that role who acts in a deeply adversarial way towards any form of diplomacy, either with the West or with regional actors, that will have an impact, but I do not think is going to be the key. I think the key question for Iran is whether, if offered basically a choice between continuing substantial economic pressure and some mode of engagement with other actors in the region, whether they find a way to get to the table. And you're right, that's an open question. They may just say no. The Saudis may just say no. But my view is that the United States should be putting a lot more chips down on the table to try to generate the start of that kind of conversation than has happened under the Trump administration over the last 3 years.
And is the beginning of that a return to the JCPOA parameters? And if so, what are the mechanics that you think the US should follow returning to the JCPOA parameters?
Well, I think we have to see where we are in January of 2021. It absolutely means returning to a nuclear agreement with Iran if Iran returns to a nuclear agreement, and then working on negotiating a follow-on agreement that deals with additional issues and that continues to secure American interests over the longer term. So the real question, though, and what we grapple with in our article is how do you relate nuclear diplomacy on the one hand to regional diplomacy on the other? I definitely do not want to be advocating for holding the former hostage to the latter, because of course it is possible the latter doesn't go anywhere. And I think it is important that we get back to a durable set of understandings on the nuclear file that can be enforced and implemented over the course of the next several years. But my view is you can have an informal linkage between these two. You can get some early wins on the nuclear program, but tie long-term sanctions relief to progress on both files. And for me, thinking in those terms is something that we should contemplate as we go forward.
And so that'll be a temporary waiver of sanctions. And as you know, I mean, the Iranians bitterly complained that some of the sanctions were lifted, but the banks still wouldn't lend to Iran, and they asked for more and more and more help. Is there a danger that they just won't trust U.S. diplomacy going forward? And if so, how do you address that danger?
There is a danger, and that's why I think it's important not for the U.S. to tie its hands the way that I think that Mike Pompeo and the Trump administration have tied their hands. They've set out this set of demands, demands that Mike Pompeo laid out in a Heritage Foundation speech a couple of years ago that are simply unrealistic and unreasonable. And as a result, there can be no progress on the nuclear file because Pompeo is tying progress on the nuclear file to cutting off support for Hezbollah, removing all troops from Syria, completely eliminating a ballistic missile program on down the line, in addition to what I think are wholly unrealistic demands on the nuclear program itself. I do not believe that that is the right course going forward, that we should just hold hostage one for the other. So it's more going to be about feel. It's going to be about sensing whether there's an opportunity as we go forward. And rather than put these two issues in complete silos and have them be utterly divorced from one another, finding ways to more informally connect the two and see, is it possible to get a short-term win on the nuclear file to basically get Iran back into compliance with the JCPOA, to then put the longer-term disposition of Iran's nuclear program on a negotiating track, and at the same time, in parallel, put some of these regional issues on a negotiating track that's actually led by the region, not led by the United States. I think that's at least something that we have to test. And I wouldn't immediately jump to an outcome of the removal of all sanctions and moving forward without at least testing whether some kind of linkage in parallel of these two tracks can work. But here's a really important point. The way that critics of the JCPOA talked about the agreement is they argued, why didn't you, the P5+1, do a deal in which you dealt with all these regional issues? And my answer to them is the P5+1 is not the right group to resolve the level and extent of Iranian activity, behavior, presence, etc., in the region. That is for the regional actors to decide. And so I utterly reject the notion that really what should be happening is the US is out there by itself negotiating with Iran the outcome of all of these regional issues. No, what the US should be doing is chiefly negotiating the nuclear file, but then facilitating and standing behind and supporting a regional negotiation where the protagonists are the regional actors themselves.
Well, the regional actors are often antagonists. And I mean, your article talks about the Saudis. I thought it was notably silent on the Israeli role. And the Israelis were among the most vociferous opponents of the JCPOA. As you think about the structure of a regional dialogue on security that involves the Israelis, that involves the Iranians and others, what is the role for Israel?
Yeah, this is why in our piece we both raise and kind of reject the notion of a formal regional organization, you know, with flags in a building and so forth to kind of run this process, because it immediately runs headlong into the type of challenge like, is Israel a part of it or not a part of it, and so forth. So instead, we think of this in much more informal terms with what we call variable geometry, where different groups of countries are in the room with one another, kind of making their views known, making their bottom lines known. And Israel would have to be a part of that broader, more informal process. That would involve considerable consultation with all the outside powers, including the United States. It would involve considerable consultation with some of the key Sunni players in the region, which may be done in more informal channels, may be done indirectly. And then, similar to the way that we've seen communication unfold, although albeit indirect communication, over Syria, messages can be passed, messages can be sent on a diplomatic basis so that Iran and Israel can also better understand where each other are coming from and what the or else is, say, behind, you know, if Israel is to say, look, we expect the following to occur in Syria, and if it doesn't, these are the steps we're going to take. I think all of that can be worked out on an informal basis without prescribing upfront what the exact modalities would look like. And it would allow for Israel's very legitimate security interests to be factored into any kind of diplomacy that went forward.
Although the tactical stuff is easier to work through than the strategic stuff, I think Israelis across the board genuinely believe that Iran poses an existential threat to Israel. I think Iranians across the board genuinely, at least in the government, believe that Israel really is trying to overthrow the Islamic Republic. That while you can agree tactically on targeting or something else, when it comes to the broader objective, I wonder how one addresses what are really pretty fundamental assessments that the other side is an existential threat.
And it's really important here not to, you know, I recognize at a moment of deep pessimism in the region, sounding this somewhat more optimistic note can almost sound pie in the sky. And I just really want to underscore, and I think if you, a fair reading of our article would underscore, we're clear-eyed about the challenges here. Even at the most ambitious, a diplomatic initiative like this would never produce peace. It would never produce Iran and Israel saying, okay, now we're friends again, as long as the current Iranian regime is in power in Tehran, at least. The most that we would be talking about would be the kinds of tactical steps that could allow a broader de-escalation, reduce the possibility of war, increase the possibility of a sustainable, durable kind of set of understandings that could create more opportunities for the region to make economic and social and security progress. So from my perspective, it's not really a critique of our proposal to say Iran and Israel are never going to see eye to eye at a strategic level, because we bake that in. Of course they're not. Nor are Saudi and Iran going to see eye to eye at a strategic level. But can they get on a path of de-escalation where at least that strategic divergence does not result in the kind of potential escalatory cycles that could lead to conflict? That's essentially what we're arguing for.
And you know, I mean, you've worked the Iranian problem for years, and one of the Iranian sort of go-to moves are gray zone operations. They're not really war. They're not really peace. They're often hard to attribute. They often use asymmetrical forces and proxies. And the Iranians often, I think, have convinced themselves that this is the only way to improve their bargaining position against stronger powers. How do you see dealing with the Iranian instinct that if things are going poorly, they try to do something to increase their bargaining position, i.e. do something hostile?
Yeah.
And if things are going well, it reinforces their sense that, aha, showing our strength improves our bargaining position. So again, they do something that's vaguely hostile, but hard to really say crosses the line.
It's a vicious cycle. I mean, it really is, right? And it's what makes this such a difficult proposition, because my answer to you at a 30,000 foot level is pretty straightforward. It's you balance pressure and diplomacy so that you're maintaining some degree of leverage to push back against and try to coerce the Iranians out of choosing to go down that road. But that's only satisfying at a very theoretical level. Practically, actually implementing something like that, particularly when there is deniability, attribution issues, and a historic practice of Iran being able to kind of say, oh, those are just our proxies doing it, and we didn't direct them, and so we told them not to, or what have you. By the way, a problem that US-Russian diplomacy is increasingly running into when it comes to issues around Little Green Men in Eastern Ukraine and so forth. So I recognize the challenge. I guess what I would argue, though, is the kind of nub of our article is that if for the last 25 years, we've looked at problems in the Middle East and basically said, let's put together a military operation to produce an outcome in a place like Iraq, or ultimately to try to have a long-term success vis-a-vis ISIS, or we'll have a military force posture and presence in the Gulf to deal with Iran. And we do, or the support for the Saudi-led coalition in Yemen. The US has kind of consistently said, oh, we can be pretty ambitious in terms of our military ends or the application of military force or leverage to produce outcomes. And then when people like you raise the kinds of practical objections you're raising now, though different in the military context than the diplomatic context, they're kind of waved away. Say, oh, we'll overcome that. The result has not been very good for American policy towards the Middle East. And I guess what I'm advocating is any course of action is going to be immensely difficult, fraught with challenge and peril, is going to require a mix of pressure and incentives and a choreography that is going to be devilishly hard. But I would much rather give it a shot on the diplomatic side in a way the US has not done, and see if we can make some progress in that regard. And if the answer ultimately is, you know what, actually, it turns out that for a variety of reasons, neither side really wants to come to the table. You can't really enforce the bargains. The Iranians are going to take advantage of it in some way. I don't actually think it will put us in a materially worse position if we take these steps than if we don't. And that's why what Dan and I are basically arguing in the piece is, give this a shot. You're not holding back any particular interest with respect to the nuclear file by doing this. You're not closing off your options to apply various forms of coercion and pressure down the road. What you're doing is trying to take the tools at your disposal and direct them towards some kind of even minimal diplomatic momentum. And frankly, our view is that come early 2021, both sides are going to have plenty of reason not to do it, but some reasons to do it that haven't been as existent in the past many years. And that's why we think this is worth giving it a shot.
I want to talk about the broader challenges of diplomacy, but first, and we've talked about our adversaries, let's talk about our friends who also pose a fairly stiff set of challenges. You spoke just last week about the importance of values in our foreign policy, and we have friends in the Gulf with whom we share lots of interests, some values we share, some values we don't share. What role should differing attitudes toward political rights, human rights, play in our bilateral relations with friends in the Gulf? And sort of, I think, not exclusively, but one of the key indicators is what should an appropriate response have been to the murder of Jamal Khashoggi?
Look, I think it has to play a more central role, as I said last week, than it has, and that includes in our relationship with Saudi Arabia, which is to say that in our strategic dialogue with Saudi Arabia, having at the highest levels a consistent message that says part of our relationship, the strength of our relationship, will depend on progress on questions related to human rights and political and economic reform. And to the extent that the Saudi leadership or the Crown Prince act in ways that are inconsistent with an understanding of moving making some progress, or in the extreme case, like with Jamal Khashoggi, the United States should take action in response. And so I think the appropriate action in response would have been a more aggressive public condemnation of what happened there than we saw from the Trump administration. B, a greater demand of transparency and accountability for exactly what happened and accounting for those who are responsible for it. And C, securing a set of pledges from the Saudi government about what they were going to do going forward to make sure this kind of thing and things like it don't happen again. Now, can we move Saudi Arabia from where it is now to where we want it to be on a political and human rights basis overnight? No. But should we basically say, in part, our long-term support for your country is going to be bound up in the directionality of progress and reform? I think we should. And I think that if the United States took that posture and was consistent and steadfast in doing so, it would produce some changes in the decision-making of the Saudi leadership, which under the Trump administration, because they basically have had a blank check, has gone in the wrong direction on jailing dissidents, curbing speech, punishing women, and murdering an American resident and prominent journalist in a grotesque and almost sort of ostentatious way. That is in my view, the result of basically saying we don't care about these issues, which has been the message for the last 3 years. And I think the United States has to say, we are prepared to put it on the line for this set of issues.
Although, the Saudi argument that I've heard from the ambassador and others, and I've heard actually from the US ambassador sometimes, is they are making reforms. They're not necessarily all the reforms we want. They're not the reforms as fast as we'd like, but they are changing the economy. Women are driving, women can travel more freely. It is all going in a positive direction, except for the political. And they would argue that reining in the religious police and everything else is a sign that broadly, the Saudis are moving in the right direction. It's just not the order we want. And if you jeopardize this, then you jeopardize the whole movement toward openness and reform in Saudi Arabia. I mean, is that just a difference of opinion, or is there something fundamentally flawed with that argument in your view?
I think this comes down to a question of credibility. And I think it is easy to sketch out and put a PowerPoint forward that says, here's going to be our sequence and here's how we're going to do it, and we're hitting these benchmarks and so forth. But ultimately, it's a gut check question of whether you actually think that narrative, that it's just a sequence question, is the right narrative, or whether the right narrative is that they're trying for a model that involves substantial economic reform, modest kind of, shall we call it, cultural reform, but a hardening on the political side, a tightening of the political vice.
Which you could argue is the China model.
Exactly, whether you think that's more where the evidence points. And, you're much more of an expert on Saudi than I am. But my view, based on everything that I've seen, is that we have real reason to believe it is the latter account as opposed to the former account. And given we have real reason to believe that, it means that we're going to need more shows of some progress on the political front in order for the current leadership in Saudi Arabia to establish credibility that, in fact, this ultimately over time is going to be a sequencing question.
It seems to me ultimately our leverage comes from a conviction that the Saudis must have. The Saudis need to have a conviction that there actually is a possibility where we would be a strong partner, we would be invested in them,
Yeah.
we would do all those sorts of things. And if they perceive that we're looking for the door anyway, and maybe this is a convenient excuse, it doesn't really matter, there's no way to build the centrality to the US back up because we're done with oil and unconventional oil and gas and all those things. How do we convince all the countries in the Gulf that we're reducing our presence, but they should seek to do more for us because they need us to be more central than we have an ordinary intention to be?
You know, this comes back to the first question you asked about anxiety versus reassurance. And it is difficult under any circumstances, and uniquely difficult in the environment we find ourselves in, where all of the countries in the Middle East sort of see the United States on a bipartisan basis looking for the exit. So I think there are three pieces to the answer for me. The first is physical US troop presence in the region. We need to decouple that from the notion of US staying power or US support. I think we can reduce our overall footprint in the region over time, including, by the way, our footprint in Saudi Arabia itself. And too often we default to add more troops to the region as kind of our answer to this is proving we're engaged. The second is that I think we should deepen our support for Saudi in terms of the legitimate threats it faces and that we've seen it face over the course of the past 2 years, whether it's ballistic missiles coming from Yemen, drones and missiles coming from the Iranians, cyber attacks, that sort of thing. I think the US should go even deeper from the point of view of its technical assistance and security cooperation on that set of issues. And then the third is exactly what Dan and I are arguing in our article, that the US say we are going to be here applying various forms of leverage, including economic leverage, as well as military dimensions, apart from whether we have 20,000 more troops or 10,000 less troops there. We're going to be present. We're going to be driving. We're going to be pushing people to the table. We're going to be holding Iran's feet to the fire. We're going to be rounding up the outside powers to all kind of get behind a process. And in that process, we will look out for your core interests. So I think putting those three together while also saying, look, here's the deal. It's going to have to change this relationship between us as it relates to these questions of values and human rights, especially in a world in which democracy is under pressure and the authoritarian capitalist model is on the march. The US is going to have to say to Saudi, look, we're not in for you guys deciding, hey, the China model is just where it's at. And so I think there is a way to put all this together with honesty, clarity, deep relationship building at a very personal level, and then kind of finding a way to separate out the question of physical force presence from continuing US staying power in the Middle East.
In your mind, was the Trump administration's response to the attacks on the Abqaiq oil facilities just about right?
Well, insofar as, my view was that the US shouldn't start a war with Iran over that at that broad level, but John, the problem I have in answering that question is we never should have been there. I mean, in a way, that was the predictable outcome of a deeply flawed American strategy, in which we overpromised to the Gulf, said if we put on maximum pressure, Iran's going to come out with its hands up and basically surrender everything and capitulate to our demands, which they did not do. And rather than recognizing what would actually happen, which is Iran would play its cards, which included advancing its nuclear program, attacking shipping in the Gulf, and attacking the Abqaiq oil facility, for which we had no ready reply. So in a way, I don't want to be stuck with the bill of a set of failed decisions that led up to that moment. And, my view is it should have never come to that, and it would not have come to that if the US had maintained a more sensible strategy towards Iran that it was handed off by the Obama administration. I would also say, though, that the Saudis kind of looked at all that, probably also didn't want the US to be starting a war with Iran, but also recognized, geez, these guys are not going to be our saviors. And we've got to think differently about how we approach the issue of Iran writ large in the region. And that's part of the reason that I believe we actually have a potential diplomatic opportunity, narrow as the window may be, in the coming months and years.
In another article in Foreign Affairs, Mark Harlan and Tammy Wittes talk about how the U.S. military presence in the Gulf sort of creates a moral hazard because the Gulf states feel empowered to do all sorts of reckless things. And I think one of the concerns that people have is that Yemen has been a fiasco from start to finish of Saudi intervention that started 5 years ago. Was it a mistake for the U.S. not to block Saudi intervention in 2015? And as we think about trying to resolve the situation, what I hear from people on the ground is the Saudis do seem to be trying to find the door. The problem is the Houthis don't want to find the door and want to hold on because they think they will continue to get a better deal. So first is, how do you deal with a state actor like Saudi Arabia that's feeling its oats and deciding to do something? But then how do you deal with non-state actors over whom the U.S. doesn't have much leverage at all?
Yeah. So, I struggle with the 2015 decision because I understand why the Obama administration decided to provide some support. The theory was basically, we can shape this in a better way, and we can keep the Saudis from doing things that are even more problematic if we have some level of participation. I understand that calculus. It turned out to be wrong. And many officials in the Obama administration subsequently came out and said, look, the theory didn't bear out. And, now basically everyone involved in Yemen policy in the Obama administration has said, end the support for the Saudi-led effort. A view I very strongly believe. I don't think we should be providing any further assistance to Saudi Arabia, military or otherwise, as they continue to prosecute this campaign. I think it's played into Iran's hands. I think it's only strengthened the Houthis. It's dragged Saudi into the kind of quagmire that it's now looking to get itself out of. And so that's the easy part. For me, the hard part is, okay, but what do you do about the Houthis as they continue to gain in technological capability and pose a threat not just to Yemen, but to Saudi itself? And what can the United States do to help Saudi Arabia defend itself? And there, I think there's a couple things. One is the U.S. can do more with Saudi to engage, and with other partners and allies, including the Europeans, to engage in interdiction operations to stop the flow of weapons to the extent it continues from Iran to the Houthis. The second is to be able to have responses if and when there is, say there's a ballistic missile attack. The US should be helping the Saudis deal in a much more targeted, narrow way with both defending itself and responding to that to show the Houthis there are real costs to doing so. But all of that falls way short of diving into the middle of the Yemeni civil war and getting bogged down in it and contributing to a humanitarian catastrophe that exceeds anything else the world has faced, with the combination of violence and disease and starvation and everything else in Yemen these past few years. So that's how I would think about it. And that's the kind, going back to one of your previous questions about, okay, how do you, on the one hand, kind of withdraw military support, and then on the other hand, tell the Saudis, hey, we want to work with you to produce a more constructive outcome in the region. This is a good example of that. You'd say, look, we're no longer in for a completely problematic, morally bankrupt policy that you are pursuing right now. On the other hand, we are therefore protecting you, imposing costs on the Houthis, imposing costs on Iran as it engages with the Houthis. Let's come up with a more targeted, limited, narrow strategy that is more sustainable and will ultimately be more successful. I actually think that we've come to the point where Saudi leadership would welcome that conversation because they recognize that just the reflexive, well, whatever you want, we'll be there for you, has not produced particularly positive outcomes over the course of the past 3 years.
To be fair, looking at at other parts of the region, the sense that we're not really there, that we don't have a dog in it, hasn't given us a big footprint in determining the outcome of the war in Syria, the outcome of the war in Libya, where now we have NATO allies aligned on other sides of this war. Libya was one where the Obama administration quite purposefully did not lead from the front. Syria was one where the Obama administration was trying to do diplomacy, but in a more supportive way where we weren't in the front lines. What should we be learning from these ongoing conflicts in Syria and Libya where the US has not been able to shape the diplomacy? The US has not been able to shape the terms of an outcome, let alone bring these things close to completion, because people perceive that we're not, if you're not there at least with some military footprint, then you're not really playing.
Right. So, I've obviously spent a huge amount of time thinking about the outcomes in these places. So,
that's why I'm asking you.
In Iraq, we go in with, a massive invasion force, and it doesn't turn out particularly well. In Libya, we do, just the air campaign with no boots on the ground, and it doesn't turn out well. In Syria, we do neither, and it doesn't turn out well. So what is the common denominator across all of the possible modes of it? In Yemen, we support another country with pure logistical and refueling and munition support, but don't actually participate, and it doesn't turn out well. So, the answer is, once you have a civil conflict in one of these countries in the Middle East, the United States is not necessarily in a great position to produce a positive outcome. So starting from that premise, if I were going back to the period of 2011, 12, 13 in Syria, I would have advocated for doing more to accomplish less. I think a big part of our challenge in these areas, I'll come on to what I mean by that, is the gap between our means and ends. So our ends in Syria through that period were Assad must go. We need a complete transition of government, but our means were basically some combination of marginal economic sanctions and various forms of support for the opposition. Definitely not enough to cross the means ends gap. So my view is, if the United States had actually been prepared to potentially take very limited direct military action, for example, in response to the gassing, but not to produce regime change in Syria, but rather to produce progress at the bargaining table, I think the chances of a potentially positive outcome would have gone up. Maybe only a little bit, maybe it'd still be a complete mess. But I actually think if we had come off of Assad must go much earlier, while also putting more skin in the game earlier, it is possible that we could have produced a better outcome. That's essentially what the Bosnia model was. It was not Milosevic must go from Belgrade. It was not an effort at regime change. Frankly, the Dayton Accord was, at the end of the day, a deeply imperfect, flawed agreement that to this day is, having a hard time kind of holding together, but it holds. And we avoided a much worse catastrophe by linking some application of US means to relatively modest diplomatic goals. And our problem in Syria is our diplomatic goal was, the transformation of Syria. And I think at the end of the day, that was probably a mistake.
And part of the challenge is the challenge of preventative diplomacy, that you don't get credit for things that people consider unlikely not happening.
Right.
And so I think one of the challenges of a real diplomatic push in the region is not that you won't be covered in glory because you're not going to have a peace agreement that's going to end centuries of conflict in the region.
Right.
but that there's a perception that because you haven't gotten peace agreements, that everything is a failure because people can't begin to imagine the things that you've presented or prevented.
Right.
So how do you get out of that trap that there's a sense that diplomats are always compromising and giving stuff up, and soldiers, at least occasionally, win?
Look, I guess my view on that is we have to, that's a matter of discipline. It's a matter of presidential leadership and other forms of leadership basically saying, I'm going for this even though it's not going to produce big bang successes. And even if we're going to get a lot of criticism from a lot of different angles, because fundamentally committing to this strategy over the course of time and sticking with this strategy presents a better chance of producing better outcomes than the alternative. And frankly, we've kind of tried the other strategy for a really long time and in a lot of ways. So let's give this a real go. The biggest problem the US has, of course, right now is any kind of sustained strategy, any kind of sustained diplomatic initiative is subject to the political calendar in the United States. And you know, my view is that if we really wanted to go all in on a big diplomatic push, we're talking years. You know, we're talking crossing presidential terms. So, you know, that brings its own challenges, given that you can have a change in president that results in really dramatic changes in policy, as we just saw with the change from Obama to Trump on Iran policy. I don't have a good answer to that, other than to say that's not a reason not to try and hope, because I don't see an alternative that is going to be more successful.
But it's an obstacle.
It's a big one.
Is there any way to minimize the impact of it, do you think?
You know, some people argue with respect to the diplomacy around the JCPOA that, you know, if only we collectively in the Obama administration had tried harder at bringing Congress along, we could, or gotten a treaty, you know, we could have created a more durable framework for nuclear diplomacy with Iran. It's true in the abstract, right? Bipartisan consensus on a foreign policy issue is better than not. But given the politics of the moment and the difficulty of generating that, I'm not sure there is a really effective way to minimize it, other than to work at it in Washington, even as we work at it in the region, to try to, from the beginning, buy Congress into the logic behind the initiative, build some bipartisan support behind it, and hope for the best. But, you know, whether or not that's ultimately going to be successful or not kind of depends on the good faith of all of the actors involved. And at least when I watched some of the Iran debate unfold, I didn't see good faith necessarily persistently flowing.
The Obama administration a couple of times put out a QDDR, a quadrennial diplomacy and development review, similar to the sort of broad strategic planning the Defense Department does. As you think about the need to reinvigorate, to reinvest in diplomacy, do you think that exercise is necessary, useful, could be adapted in some way?
I do. So I was there for the first QDDR. And the fact that the Defense Department has been doing quadrennial defense reviews for many, many years to organize the intersection of strategy, policy, and budget. And this had never happened at the State Department or USAID. I mean, that's kind of crazy. So I think it is a highly necessary undertaking that, as a systematic matter, as a almost like sort of built into the muscle memory of our diplomatic and development function, that we are setting out an alignment of strategy and budget, strategy and resources, ends and means, in ways that have rigor and that can create longer term frameworks for the kind of engagement that we need going forward. I think it will elevate diplomacy and development in the canon of US foreign policy tools in helpful ways.
And let me ask a practical diplomatic question to finish up. Russia in the Middle East seems very opportunistic and generally a spoiler. Is China a potential partner for the US in the Middle East? Is it a spoiler? Is it irrelevant? How should the US, as it thinks broadly about the world, think about Russia's sometimes bottom feeding in the Middle East, but also China's growing role, the growing attention that China gets, both positive and negative.
Yeah, so starting with Russia, I think opportunistic is a great word, and I think spoiler is a great word. And when you're dealing with an opportunistic spoiler, you just have to be opportunistic in where it can potentially align with your interests, and then you need to be pushed back where it doesn't. So I think we need to be totally unsentimental about how we deal with Russia in the Middle East, and not think they're going to be our savior in any respect, but also not think that just because they're, a pretty wretched regime at this point with everything that they're doing vis-a-vis the United States, that we can't engage them on certain issues. And in fact, we worked closely with them in the context of the P5+1 to try to produce, progress on the nuclear file. And Russia was at moments a constructive actor, even if in the main, in the Middle East, it is anything but a constructive actor. China's a harder one for me because honestly, China's engagement on the JCPOA was weak and sort of directionless. And it's not clear to me that they have a well-developed sense of how they can contribute effectively to the diplomacy in the region. I think they have a well-developed sense on the extractive industry side of, how they can get energy and try to make sure they've got a secure, stable supply of oil and gas, from the region. But I don't think that we should see China right now as being, some kind of great constructive partner in dealing with the challenges in the region. I think we should put them basically in a similar box that we do with Russia, which is if there's a moment we could work with them and they could be helpful to us, great. There are going to be areas where we don't see eye to eye. Let's push back. And let's not get ourselves into the view of saying, oh, you know what the next great move is here? Bring China more to the center of diplomacy in the Middle East. I don't think that would necessarily work to our long-term advantage.
Well, one of the advantages the Chinese do have is that there's a perception in the region that the Chinese are there for the long haul, and a perception the U.S. isn't there for the long haul, that the Chinese are on their way in and the U.S. is on its way out. Is it necessary to address that perception? And if so, how do you address that perception?
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest thing that
American concern with pulling back.
For me, the biggest part of that is not about trying to convince the region anything about China. It's to convince them about the United States and to reject the notion of we're out, we're leaving. And in order to reject that notion, I think we have to break through the false binary that says being in means being super militarily in, and being out is if you're not militarily in, you're out. And that is really ultimately the jumping off point for the foreign affairs article, which is.
And so what are the visible signs of U.S. commitment? If it's not, people can see bases, people can see arms sales, people can see troops. Is it, the Secretary of State being constantly on the road, but even so, what's the metric by which people are going to be able to judge U.S. commitment in a more diplomatic centered world?
Well, just think about your last two questions. It's sort of interesting. You said in your previous question, you said the premise was that they see China as in. China doesn't have a base, and China doesn't have, at least not yet, and China doesn't have a military presence in the region, and yet they're not suffering from the same false binary that we are. And frankly, from my perspective, and why is that? Because of economic relationships, capital, diplomacy, intelligence, all of the instruments of power that a great power should have and should be able to apply. And so my view is that it is a multifaceted approach the US should be taking. And by the way, I'm not arguing for getting out of every base in the Middle East. There is a military posture dimension to this at a reduced footprint. But it's all those other elements of power. It is our commercial and economic engagement. It is our intelligence relationships. It is our diplomacy. It is our development efforts to actually push for economic and political modernization and reform. That all collectively can come at a much lower fiscal cost than major American military deployments to the region and actually produce better results on the ground.
Jake, thank you very much for joining us today. Please read Jake's foreign affairs piece. And also, if you only caught part of the discussion today, the entire discussion will be placed on the CSIS website. Thank you very much for joining us. Thanks, Jake.
Thank you.